Susie here, the Frugal Crafter. Today I'm going to show you how to color glass using water-based markers. You can actually use your alcohol-based markers too if you want to, but I believe this technique is a little bit easier with watercolor markers. And you don't have to have artist quality watercolor markers. You can use Crayolas because I'm going to teach you the palette blending technique, which I've shown you before, but I want to go over it again because I know a lot of you guys are new. This video is brought to you by Rubber Stamp Tapestry. This is one of their new stamps. It comes in this set. This is the Summer on the Farm set. We're going to be using the mason jars from this set, and it's very versatile. They have a whole set of new unmounted stamps that go really well with their peg stamps, so I really recommend you having a look at those if you are in the market. Now, I did another little version here. I took the smaller mason jar. Instead of stamping the lid, I simply wiped the ink off that portion of the stamp, stamped it, and colored it. And the reason these are really sparkly is because instead of using just water on a brush, which you totally can do, or you can use a water brush, I used a Wink of Stella pen, and this is a pen that has a brush tip. Actually, these make really excellent water brushes after you've used up all the glitter. And I had used this up, and then I just filled it with water and shook it up and used it again, and I still have tons and tons of glitter. And I heard you could do that about like 3 times before you run out of glitter on this. So these are kind of pricey. These are about they're between like $6 and $8, I think, maybe as much as 10 depending on where you live, but considering the fact that you get a beautiful non-leaking fine tip water brush after it's all used up, which seems to be like 3 times after you filled it with water, I think it's a pretty good investment. So I did try making my own, but I have to say the fine tip on this and the shimmer is just fantastic, and I would recommend it if anybody's interested in that sort of thing. But you don't have to use a Wink of Stella brush. Here's an example I did using just a fine tip water brush, and honestly you can use a round brush, like a small, like number 5 round dipped in water, and it will be exactly the same. You do not have to buy a water brush for this, but this technique is going to be the same no matter what you do. I am going to use the Wink of Stella just because some of you guys probably have not seen it. I don't use it that much, so it'd be a good chance for you guys to see that in action. So the first thing I've done is I've cut a piece of watercolor paper, and this is 4.5 inches by 6 inches, and it is inexpensive Canson XL watercolor paper. And I really like that watercolor paper for stamping because if you can tell, it's not very bumpy. Oh, I wanted to let you know I got a coupon code for Rubber Stamp Tapestry, our sponsor. It is GLASS, so it'll be easy to remember. So if you go to pegstamps.com, place an order of over $10 of mounted stamps, you can get 20% off with that coupon code GLASS. And I'm going to be stamping today with gray ink. So there's a few colors of waterproof ink I like to have on hand. I like black, brown, and gray. And sometimes I want to use gray because I want to be able to see the line, but I don't necessarily want them super duper dark. And this is a perfect example of when I want a softer line. So I'm going to stamp the big jar twice. So you see, if I had black, it would look all right, but I think it would look very cartoonish once we colored it and wouldn't look as realistic like glass does. It wouldn't have that translucency if I had done that. I'm going to get the second one just a little offset from the center. And now I'm going to use a smaller one here. And here's a little tip. If you don't have that many stamp blocks and you're doing a project, you can always put one on either side and stamp that way. I do that quite a bit. And that's how I had those mounted because I was doing that other little card there. So now I'm going to do one that overlaps. I'm just trying my hardest to keep everything from being wonky. I want the sides of my jar to be up and down as much as possible. Some will be a little crooked, but it'll be all right. And this one I'm going to have tucked behind the one I just didn't have it a little bit further back. So if I stamp something up, if the bottom of the jar is a little bit up further on my card, that is going to make it look like it's behind it on the table. And if something is down further on the card, it's going to look like it's in front of it. But since these are transparent objects, we don't have to mask anything, so that's kind of fun. And it is kind of difficult for me to stamp, straight while I'm sitting kind of far back so my head's not in the way. So if I get something a little off, it won't really matter to the tutorial. You'll still be able to see what I'm doing. And if you might want to check in the middle of this one every once in a while. If you're tapping it down on your ink pad like I am, sometimes you will get a little ink in the middle. Just wipe it off with your finger or a rag, baby wipe or something, and you'll solve it. And I wanted to kind of have a little bit of a interesting line. I didn't want everything all lined up on a windowsill. That would be pretty and all, but I wanted to have a little bit more staggered heights. there we go. We have all of our things stamped. So I love things in rainbow order, and I'm just gonna find my original one here to show you what I mean. I like to put things in rainbow order. I think it's pretty and cheerful, and that's the way we are going to color that today. So we are going to be doing a technique called palette blending, and your palette can be anything really. It can be a piece of laminated cardstock. It can be a tile like I have here. It could be a plate, like a ceramic plate. Anything really. In fact, I'm going to show you here, but I got my towel so I could be fancy, but this is how I really do it. I had this baby white box sitting on my table. I'm like, oh, there you go, palette. I just grab whatever's closest. Honestly, it wipes right off, not a big deal. And I am going to scribble out the colors that I plan on using. So I've got this nice red, and I'm going to do this nice orange. So it's basically like we're making a watercolor palette. So if you wanted to do this with watercolors, totally can, but I know that you might not want to bother with watercolors, so that's fine too. Just gonna put all of our little colors out there. I like to go in the order that I'm gonna color them, kind of, just so I have that there. Some colors are super intense, like the blue and purple that I've got, that I really want to use them off the palette because they're just too strong coming off the marker. And the markers I'm using today are the Zig Real Brush pens. They're beautiful, but rest assured you can do this with your kids' Crayolas. You do not need to have these markers to do this technique. That's what I really like about this technique. It allows you to take cheaper materials, like you can do this with alcohol pens and use an alcohol blender instead of a water brush, or you can use inexpensive kids markers, Mr. Sketchies, whatever you have, and it lets you have that look of having like a bazillion artist quality materials. So I'm going to pick up that ink with my clean color, with my Wink of Stella, and I'm going to start coloring it around the edges, because the edges, when you're looking at colored glass, it's generally the edges that are going to be the darkest. And I'm just going to take my time so that I don't get it off the edge. Now these pens here have a little bit of a like a lubricant in it, whatever the fixative is. It might be, there might be some glycerin or some gum arabic in there, but there's something that helps it kind of glide across the paper. If you're doing this on cardstock, I am using a watercolor paper, as I mentioned before, but if you're doing this on cardstock, what I recommend you using is a blender pen made for watercolor markers, and Tombow makes them. Marty La Plume makes them, but I don't really like the La Plume ones. They tend to pill the paper. Stampin' Up! Makes a really good one. They come in like 3 packs for $10, but and I think the Tombow one is around $3 too. So they're about the same price, and you can get the Tombow one from, you know, more variety of places. The Stampin' Up! One you'd call your local Stampin' Up! Distributor for that. But I like it because it's a pen. It's like a marker tip, a brush tip marker, but it's got like water and glycerin in it, so it really helps you slide across. So that's our first layer. We're going to go across, and look, since I'm going to the next color, I'm going to orange. Orange has red in it, so I don't have to clean my brush. I'm just going to grab that. I'm going to overlap what I've already done, because with translucent glass, you're going to see through it. You're going to see that color underneath, and that's going to look realistic if I show it all. And again, let me stress that this is a beginner tutorial. I'm assuming that somebody's finding this tutorial, they have never done this before. So if I'm going too slow for you, if you're watching this video on YouTube, there's a gear at the bottom of the player. You click that and you can speed me up 2 times or 1.5 times, and I'll sound like a deranged squirrel. It's quite entertaining, and you don't have to sit through so much. So I'm scribbling my brush off because I do want to get some of that orange off. And now I'm going to pick up the yellow, and I'm going to color this one in. Now I'm not coloring the lids. I'm going around the lids because I am going to be doing those with a gray marker in a little while. It's okay if some of the color streaks into the adjacent bottle, because with glass you have highlights and shadows, but you also have refractions, which is when the light distorts inside of the glass, and you have reflections. So you could have reflections from any of these on other ones, then you can have refractions of the glass and shadows and highlights. That's why it kind of, people can get intimidated and it can feel a little complex because there's so much going on there, but it doesn't have to be complex. You'll see here today that I'm going to show you a very easy way to do this, and I find it very pleasurable to paint glass because I love seeing all those vivid, transparent colors. It's probably why my paint of choice is watercolor, because I love the look of that. But I don't want anyone to feel like they have to be a watercolorist or that they have to be an advanced colorer to do this, because you really do not. Kind of reminds me, you know, like there was a project on Pinterest that was like, everybody was doing this for a while. They were taking mason jars and putting glue and food coloring, mixing it up and swirling it around in the mason jars and getting like jars like this, like these colored jars. That kind of inspired this. And I think I want a little more green in there. Now, something that is an advantage to the Zig real brush markers, because they do have a little brush. It's actually a brush there. You can go over something wet and add color, where if you did that with a regular marker, the marker would kind of want to soak up whatever was on the paper, and it wouldn't lay down color. It would just kind of soak up whatever moisture was on the paper if you were trying to go on wet paper, and it might pill the paper too, but the Zig markers are very gentle. You don't get as smooth of a blend though, even with these. If you were to do this with a felt tip marker, I think you would end up marring the paper, but that's where the tile comes in, because no matter what you're using, you can use a tile and it's going to be fine. So now I'm going to grab some of this. This is kind of like my ball jar blue color, you know, that beautiful vintage mason jar color. I just love that color. It's like a pretty aqua. I'm going to do that one here. Now, another thing I like about this is that this is one of those cards that you can use for any occasion. It could be a birthday, it could be a get well. If you want, like I mentioned here, if you didn't stamp the lid, if you kind of just inked the stamp up to there and stamped it, and you could put any of your peg stamp flowers in there, or any of the single flowers that come in the unmounted stamps, and there's a beautiful card right there, and it doesn't take a long time to color. So I like those projects that you get the satisfaction of creating. It looks kind of complicated, but it really doesn't take you that long. Now this next blue that I'm going to use, it's more like a cobalt blue. It is a little bit trickier because it's a more intense color and it doesn't lift as well. It's a very stainy color. So I've got to be kind of careful when I use that. Only use a little bit and then spread it around. And this right from the marker is really too intense. I wouldn't want to do what I did on the green jar with that blue, because it is such a bright color. It's such a bold and staining color. Some colors will glide across the top and you can move them around, and other colors want to stain. And in general, markers will want to stain more than watercolor pencils or watercolor paint. So keep that in mind when you're working. It's kind of better to work with kind of subtle layers like we are here, and build it up rather than to kind of charge in with a bunch of color at once. And now I'm going to grab the purple, which again is another really bold color. Oh, something I wanted to mention about these Zig pens. Once you get them going, you don't need to squeeze them. So when if you haven't used them in a while, the first time you use them, you give them a little squeeze and a droplet comes out and then you're good to go. When I first started using this pen, I was squeezing it every time I went to color something. Like, even I would keep squeezing it, right? And that's why I used up the pen so quickly. And somebody commented, "Oh, Lindsay, you don't use it like that. You were going to wear it out. You're going to use it up." And I did. I used it up way too early. And then but luckily though, you could refill it a few times. So I just wanted to let you know that, because otherwise you will be wasting a lot of the ink in there. But this is something that I kind of was hesitant on because it was really popular, and I tend to be very hesitant on the really popular new things. And this really was worth the hype, I have to say, if you like the sparkly look. Okay, so there is layer one. Now I want to do layer one on the lids here, but that's actually a little bit easier, because what we're going to do is I'm going to flip this around because I don't want to lay my hand in any of that wet paint. Wet ink, and I'm just going to add color to each side of this. And by doing this, just like we did our metal last week, it's going to make it rounder. It's going to make it appear cylindrical, just like we did with all the pots that we painted last week, we colored last week on our rubber stamp tapestry stamp school. So we're doing that here. And that's also going to make our lids seem opaque, because we did stamp everything on top. We didn't do any masking, right? And then I'm going to take my marker, I'm scribbling off the any purple, and I am going to kind of spread that out. I'm loosening up that pigment and I'm just spreading it out. So look at that, we get such a nice blend there. And that's where working on watercolor paper comes in handy. If you're doing this on cardstock, you might want to go one at a time, like color one of the grays, like one of the lids, blend it, then go to the next lid, color it, blend it, and so on and so forth. Because cardstock does not have the sizing that watercolor paper does. It just is not designed to hold a lot of wet ink. It is designed to take wet ink. It's designed to work with your printer, but it is not designed to be soaked. You know, that's why I recommend that marker over using a water brush or a zig brush. If you're really gonna work it, you could totally use the zig brushes on that. Now I feel like this is not flowing right now, so I'm gonna give it a little squeeze on the palette so I can always dip back into that. I'm not gonna waste that ink. And you can see how it wants to puddle and pool there. That's probably a little bit much, but I wipe it off on my tile so I don't really waste it. I can always go back and reactivate it. Add a little metallic shimmer to those. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it around and we are going to go in with our next layer. So this time, with the exception of those last two colors, which are really bold, I'm going to go right from my pen. So on this red one, I am going to go in here and I'm going to darken up anything I think would have a little bit of a darker streak. So like the edges of the ball jar, the bottoms, any place where you have more than one thickness of glass, you can see can have those deeper colors. So I'm just kind of trying to get those streaks and reflections and refractions and all that good stuff in there. Oh, something else I want to do. I think I'm going to do this right now. I am going to add my shadow areas, just because I like to pull some color from the jars themselves when I do my shadows, because you have not only shadows, but you've got the light coming through the jars, and I really think that's a pretty effect. And I'm going to do that with my gray, and I can go right in there with the gray and kind of just sketch in my shadows. I like to have it darkest right underneath the jars and then streak it out. If you do like prominent streaks like that, just try to keep them all parallel to each other, all the streaks about the same, so you don't end up with any weirdness. And then I'm just going to soften them a little bit. Very illustrative, very sketchy looking. Okay, so now when I go in here and I start liquefying this layer of my ink, I could take some of that color and bring it out here into my shadow, because when the light shines through, it's also bringing color. So I can just dab some of that in there, and it looks really pretty once we get them all in there. I'm going to go in with our orange. As you can notice, I don't need to skip around. You might think, well, I should probably skip around because I've got all that wet ink, just like I would if I was watercoloring. But it's not as necessary here, especially with the glass, where we want it to we want the colors to kind of overlap and float around and affect one another, affect each other. I feel like my shimmer is coming out really fast because I had primed it. I had squeezed it because it had stopped flowing. So you do have to kind of be mindful of that. Now on the yellow, it's such a light color that I really don't need to go back in and blend, you'll notice here. I can just go in. Oops, I forgot to add my orange to the shadow there. Let's do that first. Like, I don't need to go in at all with that yellow. I'm just going to pick a little yellow up off my palette to add it to the shadow there, but that's all I really need to do. And if you do have like a light coming through, you can add that color to the vase that highlight would be passing through. So just kind of keep that stuff in mind as you're going. The green, you can also go in and add like little details to like the words that, like the word ball that's on some of those jars, or the big B, I should say. And you just decide, make a case-by-case decision whether you need to blend it out or not, because you might like it just the way it is. And we'll go in and we'll blend. If I feel like I have too much color, I'll just pick some of that up and bring it into my shadow. If I don't have enough, then I'll throw some on my palette and pick it up that way. by using this brush to move stuff around is very forgiving. And we'll do the blue. The blue is, this one is alright. I can go in with a marker on this one, but the other one is really dark. So anytime you think like you might have too much of the color on your brush before you go to another color, you can scribble it off. Okay, so for that one, I'm just going to go in my palette. See how dark that is right off the palette? See, it would have been too dark off the marker. Just going to streak some of it up. And then to the shadow. And we're going to do the same thing with that last purple color. And the more experience you get with your markers, the more you'll learn how much, how strong they are and different ways to apply them. So don't worry if your first attempt is not perfect, because that's a great thing about art. You can keep playing with it till you get it just the way you want it. Alright, so now I'm going to go back into the lids, and I am going to add some color that I don't intend on blending. I'm going in with that gray. You can add details, you can add a shadow under the lid if you want to. I don't go too crazy with detail, but I might put like the threads if I can see like where the thread would be. I'll do that, but generally I'm doing the color towards the edge, maybe under the thread if I've got a thread on there, or at the bottom of it. I don't do everyone exactly the same. They can all vary a little bit because the light's going to be hitting them all slightly different because they're in different positions. And I'm going to scribble a little bit of that on my palette, and I can work on my shadow a little bit there if I want to add any more shadow onto the tabletop there. And now it would just be looking at it and deciding if I wanted any more super dark areas. I think I do want to maybe accentuate the bee in that. Nothing too crazy, just maybe just a little slice along the bottom. I do like to do the little dark slice along the bottom because it helps break it apart from the table. I think the yellow one looks all right. Green, I could do a little slice along the bottom. This could use a little bit. So you can see each layer I do, I'm a little bit darker each time. I could go in with that blue. I just need to be very cautious that maybe just a little bit of shadow under there. And our purple, again, I have to be cautious, but I can go in there with it. And then for my shadows on the table, I can go in with the gray and just kind of bring a little bit of darker shadow where it meets the table, just to break it apart a little bit. And then my final highlight I actually have to do after this is dry, so I'm going to dry this and then we'll do our high highlighting. This is my favorite step because it's like the icing on the cake, and we're going to use a white gel pen for this. My favorite brand is the Uniball Signo just because I haven't had an issue with it clogging and the ink is really bright white and opaque. And I'm just going to go in any place I think the light would be hitting it and leaving a highlight, I am going to color it in. So actually the stamp had a highlight that had a couple little round highlights there, so I thought that was a great place to start. I find the edges are great to do kind of a line down. Now our light's coming from that corner and kind of shooting inward, but like I said with glass, it reflects and refracts and moves light around a lot. So I can kind of even just look at places that are really dark, like those dark shadows I put on the bottom. Those are a great place just to pull out a slice of highlight. and you can do like squiggly lines. If your highlights are not dark enough, you can always go back in and you can add some more. If you pick up some ink underneath by accident, maybe you didn't have it dry well enough, you can always wipe your pen off on a scrap piece of paper to clean it. So the middle of each of these lids are going to get a highlight. Just a scribble, because there's texture. We want to get that texture on there. And then I can do a couple little dots on what you think would be the shadow side, but the reason I'm doing it here is because it's metallic, it can be reflected, and that's also a dark area, so it really shows up well. And you can do like a little wiggle line there, just a little, like a little S kind of. I like to put them up here. I like to put them like here where the jar kind of starts to push out, and I love to do a little slice of highlight at the bottom of the jar because that makes it really stand out. Any jars that are in front of other jars, that's a great place to put a highlight because it pulls it away from the one in behind. A great rule of thumb, or a great practice I should say rather, is to set up some jars. Look around for some pretty colored jars in your home and set them up on a windowsill, or just set them on your table and put a lamp on, like facing them, and see how they reflect the light. See how you can look and see items through them. It's just a wonderful way for you to be able to experience the light reflection and refraction firsthand. So this one's in front, so I'm going to slice that highlight right over where you can see the jar in back, so it really brings it forward and gives you a good, just a good feeling of what's in front and what the form is. I like that one right there. So it's kind of fun with glass because it's not going to have the same properties as anything else. Glass and metal, they're very unusual, and that's why I wanted to break down both of them for tutorials for you, so you could color them and not feel intimidated, because they are really fun things to color. And all these little slices of color and highlight and shadow are what gives it that shiny look that glass has. And that pretty much does it. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to tip it here because sometimes a glimmer from that those Wink of Stella pens, you can see the shine there. Sometimes when you have it just right, my studio lights make it look darker. This one's completely dry, so why don't I bring this one out so that you can see. I think it's so rewarding and fun to color glass, and I hope you give it a try. You can use whatever you have for watercolor markers. You can use anything from a piece of laminated plastic to a piece of plastic packaging to anything shiny, basically, in white, so you can see what color it is as your palette, and have fun with it. If you don't have a water brush, use any brush you have, just dip it in water and use it. If you do have one of these Wink of Stella pens, it's a great excuse to get it out and give it some love. I hope you enjoyed this. Please give me a thumbs up if you did, and let your friends know about this video if they are crafty too. Don't forget to visit our sponsor, Rubber Stamp Tapestry. You can find them online at pegstamps.com, and don't forget to use the coupon code GLASS to save 20% on your mounted stamp order of $10 or more. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, happy crafting.